if a small city is thinking about doing an accelerator, something that is cohort based, maybe a little bit of money, it's something that you guys aren't doing now, but what were some of the things that you would tell them to make sure that they do, and then make sure that they don't do?
So yeah, I mean, almost without exception, they're doing it wrong, right? So uh, I don't know if you're familiar with Startup Fest. It's a big annual conference up in Montreal, and sometimes I speak there, and sometimes I speak at the predecessor event to it, like the day earlier, which is just for accelerators. So there was a talk I gave about the brutal economics of running an accelerator program because it's really a lot harder than anyone who has not been through it, as can imagine. So there's usually a couple of different deals that you have to make with the devil to get this off the ground, and one of them is working with an economic development corp. That's one of the options. And when you do that, the problem is number one, you're dealing with people who have no clue what you're doing, right? They are in government. If you made a graph of all the people who are most likely to get the entrepreneurial journey, like, maybe teachers are less likely to get it, if only because, they've chosen very, very stable professions with low risk profiles. Government workers are right there. So number one,
They hate that you're saying that too, by the way.
yes, and I try to smile when I say that, but I never claim to be a nice person. The truth is that, and I'm not making a value judgment here, but different people choose different professions in part based on their tolerance for risk and uncertainty. And when you're in government roles, you have a low tolerance for risk. You like predictability. And as you go up into corporate, you get a little bit more risk. And as you go into startups, you're pushing like evil Knievel jumping the Grand Canyon level of like risk loving. So number one, you're dealing with people who don't get what you're doing. And number two, they are aiming for the wrong things. Usually one of their success metrics is, if not the number one success metric, is number of jobs created, right? And they have what I call the Instagram problem. So Instagram, when they sold to Facebook for $1 billion, you know how many employees they had?
I
13.
think it was like 20. Yeah.
Not even 13. No, but you're a lot closer than many people are. So if you are a VC and if you're an accelerator that's trying to make money on your investments, you should be. That's a huge win. $1 billion exit. If you're an economic development company, or if you're a municipal accelerator trying to like bring jobs in and create a startup ecosystem, uh, that's not a win,
Yeah.
right? Not if you're measuring it by jobs created. So then you get pressure to take exactly the kind of companies that are no good for startups. So like consultancies or dev shops or design studios where they need to hire more bodies to grow. And that's good if your goal is to increase employment, but it's the exact opposite. Like a great startup scales disproportionately to the amount of bodies they throw at something.
If you look at, and so I 100% agree with that. Um, if you look at something like the metrics that SBDCs and SBAs track, it's hours with the company, jobs
Mm-hmm.
created, jobs saved, and then like total revenue, maybe total revenue increase, but nowhere in there profitability. Return on investment to people, which I think is
Mm-hmm.
what people in your in accelerator worlds are really trying to do. Like you invest in a company to make
Mm-hmm.
more money off of it. And so you're on the 1004 show, and I felt like this is a good chance for me to give this plug because I don't always do it. And so a few years ago, I was in an economic development meeting with a bunch of people trying to help recruit businesses and help grow
Mm-hmm.
the southeastern Virginia area. And they said all this area needed is to basically recruit 4 large businesses with 1,000 employees each. And I said, that's really weird. What if you flip flop that, understanding that businesses are growing differently, and tried starting or growing 1,000 businesses with 4 employees each? Because if those 4 employees can make 150 to $200,000 a year, it could be super,
Mm-hmm.
just like Instagram was. That's a huge win. It might not hit the number of the jobs thing, but that shouldn't be the metric that communities look at, especially as we're changing. And so it's if you don't have to have 2,000 employees, why should you? The business owner should be smart about that and doing that. And so, where do you think the disconnect is there for them to not understand that jobs isn't the same metric that it was, 20,
Yeah,
50
it's
years
a
ago?
little short termish. And by the way, that's not a bad approach for economic development. It is a bad approach if you want to use startups as your engine for economic development. So number one, you also bear in mind that these are elected officials by and large, right? So the 8 to 12 year time frame that you're dealing with when you're dealing with a startup at the kind of soil level of ideation.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so far in the future that they don't
So
know
it's
where they're
about
going to
ribbon
be.
cuttings then?
A little bit.
Yeah.
There's a little bit of that, whether they're conscious or not. Like you can point to jobs, like you can point to hours spent, even though that's an input, not an output. So I argue that that's really just, you know, at best a proxy for future success, and candidly the worst proxy. Right? You end up just throwing poor mentors at it, like guys who shouldn't be mentoring, just to bring that number up, and you end up being counterproductive. So at best, that's a proxy for future success. At worst, it's probably a proxy for future lack of success. Uh, but most of the time, it's like jobs are something concrete that they can point to, and if you're going for the traditional metric, you can do that within a 4 year term of a typical elected official. Now, I would argue, and I would try to reframe the debate as, if if you create the next Instagram for $1 billion, and that company was headquartered in your area, and even if they weren't, even if it was just the founder has fond memories of where he came from and he wants to come back and help the ecosystem, think about the increase to the tax base. Think about the amount of money that's coming. And think about the fact that now here's a guy with a couple $100 million in his pocket who loves where he came from and wants to invest in his community. So it becomes kind of a much longer term virtuous cycle that you're trying to kick off. So you have to get them in that kind of long-term mindset. You got to get them thinking a little bit more about the exit being the big pot of gold.
So 15, 20, 25 years long term? Or how long do you
Well,
think?
I mean, if you could say, if I did that, they just tune you out. But if you were to say, hey, it's going to be 8 years or more,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that's 2 terms. Like you're basically barely on the edge there of their ability to deal with. But then you say, and by the way, Instagram, even like in year 6 already, it was clear they're a win. You can point to these guys. They've raised multiple rounds. They're a unicorn. So maybe you can get them thinking less in terms of like, you know, the number of anonymous jobs that they can point to versus really high profile wins. Like, hey, we have an Instagram in our community in the making, right? So that becomes something very high profile they can talk to
And
and
you
they
can
can go to
promote
the
that big
office.
time. I mean, can you imagine all the
You can
flags? Oh,
try.
we created Instagram.